Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Lynn Center Annual Lecture for 2025. My name is Catherine Liu. I'm the director of the Lynn Center. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Anthony Kaldellis. He's a professor of classics at the University of Chicago. And I see that many of all the people who have come, you must all know him a little bit as well. His research explores the history, culture, and literature of the East Roman Empire from antiquity to the 15th century. And he has published many books and articles on this time and area ranging from the 4th to the 15th centuries. He has translated into English the works of many medieval Greek writers, and his own monographs have been translated into other modern languages, including Turkish, French, Romanian, Russian, and Greek. In 2019, some of you may know, he created the first academic podcast of his field, Byzantium and Friends. He's most recently published a new comprehensive history of Byzantium, the New Roman Empire, published with Oxford University Press in 2023, which embeds the social, economic, religious, and demographic developments within a lively narrative framework. And I can say that it's lively because I did read the paper for tomorrow's research seminar, and I just thoroughly enjoyed all 16 pages of it. So I know that he writes extremely well, and I would recommend any of his books to you. This lecture is based on a completed and forthcoming book project coming out, I believe, next year on the fall of Constantinople, 1453. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anthony Kaldellis to the Lynn Center.
So, hi, everyone. So I wish my topic were somewhat more uplifting, but I am going to be talking about captivity, slavery, liberation, in the context of an event that I've been studying for some time. On May 29th, 1453, the city of Constantinople disappeared. Now, it matters how you picture that statement. So what you think happened on that fateful day. I did not mean that statement figuratively, right? That the city's fall marked its passage from a millennium when it had been the capital of an Orthodox Roman state, only to embark on a new career as the capital of the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim state. I mean it actually in a very literal sense. But it is not a picture that you can easily form in your mind based at least on what has been written about the events of 1453. You probably picture the Sultan's soldiers bursting through the walls on that morning and killing and plundering for the customary 3 days, whereupon they occupy the city and the Sultan Mehmed plans its transformation as his own capital city. Now, if you come from one cultural background, you may celebrate this as a glorious conquest. And if you come from another one, it is a dark day of death and defeat. But either way, you probably won't picture what actually happened. What actually happened was that within hours, Constantinople's entire population had been rounded up and removed from the city, taken either to the Ottoman army's camps outside the walls on the land side or to the fleet, which was in the harbor. By nightfall, the city was a ghost town. It was quiet, but for the distant sound of the celebrations taking place in the camps outside, or the laments of the conquered, whose families were already being broken up. Apart from a few guards posted by the Sultan, the city remained empty like this for days. He then disbanded his army, which was very expensive to maintain there, and they all went back to their homes, taking their captives with them. And that was that for Constantinople. Now, a few of those people managed to return, and I'll get to that in a moment. But for certainly a few days, the city was completely empty, and for some years thereafter, it was mostly deserted. Mehmed found it difficult to persuade people to go back and live there. And it was not entirely clear at first that he intended to make it his new capital. It was not until 5 years later that he first spent a winter there. And then showed through building programs and a new palace and his efforts to repopulate the city that he did have great things in store for it. But that is what I meant when I said that on the 29th of May, 1453, Constantinople disappeared. Never before in its history had it been emptied out of its entire population, nor would that ever happen again. And this is a major rupture, even in the continuity of its culture and population. For those years, it remained a kind of mostly silent museum to its own glorious past. Now, this is not going to be an image-heavy talk. I'm just going to show a few. I could have loaded it down with lots of images, but instead of showing the required French miniature from a manuscript of that time, which depicts the events of the siege in the wrong cultural idiom, I opted for this 16th century, more orthodox-looking. The colors are right. Actually, you can look at a lot of the details. They actually got them right. They're canons, too, which you don't see often in Orthodox iconography. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout the Christian and Muslim worlds, and it instantly became a matter of debate and interest. And many sensed that in some fundamental ways, this event had kind of changed the balance of the world, and that it reflected broader transformations that were taking place in the 15th century. Now, it is no accident that eyewitness accounts of the siege were written very soon thereafter in Latin, Italian, Greek, Turkish, and Russian. And dozens of secondhand accounts were produced in these and other languages in the decades to come. There's possibly no great siege, maybe excepting that of Troy, had produced such a rich body of narrative and debate. Even today, the event galvanizes attention through popular histories, TV shows, movies, novels, and official commemorations. But at the time, reactions varied. So there were those who accepted the outcome. Mehmet, for example, swiftly sent announcements of his victory to other Muslim rulers, boasting that he had fulfilled the Prophet Muhammad's prediction that a Muslim army would conquer Constantinople one day. Others had no choice but to come to terms with it. So these are especially Christians, both Orthodox and Catholic, who expressed their grief in rhetorical works, speeches, and poetic lamentations. There would be a flood of them to come in Greek for decades and, in fact, even centuries. Especially in vernacular Greek, this became a kind of genre. But there was also a great deal of blaming the victims, too. So, for example, some Catholics in the West argued that the Orthodox had deserved what they got because they had so far failed or refused to subordinate their church, the Orthodox Church, to the Pope. And they're alluding here to the question of the union of churches, which was a very live issue at the time. There had been centuries of efforts and debates and discussion to find some way for these two churches to unite or reunite, depending on how you saw it. And they had usually always failed, resulting in suspicion and mutual acrimony. If only the Greeks had rejoined the Mother Church of Rome, some argued, more help would have come from the West, like in time. And yes, it would have made a difference. Now, as it happens, the last emperor of Constantinople, Konstantinos Palaiologos, whom we call Constantine XI, he had accepted union with Rome. In fact, there was a special ceremony and a liturgy, a church service held on the 12th of December, as everyone knew that a siege was coming, just a few months before the armies arrived. They had held a special service to commemorate and ratify union between the churches. A Catholic cardinal, Isidore, had presided. Now, he was an ethnic Greek, a Roman from the Peloponnese, but he was also a Catholic cardinal. And he was one of the chief negotiators between the churches at this time, And so for him and for the emperor, this counted as union. However, this also meant that anti-union theologians in the Orthodox Church could argue that the city fell precisely because of the celebration of union in Hagia Sophia with the heretical Catholics. So this position, for example, was espoused by Gennadios Scholarios, who would become the first patriarch of Constantinople after the fall. It was for him also a way of making moral sense of what had happened, this great catastrophe, but from the other side of the question of union. So it also was a way of blaming the victims, of whom he was one. He had spent some time in captivity as well. Now, there were also other views that basically refused to accept what had happened. So, in a certain sense, I would put this Orthodox legend into this category. This is the legend of the marbled king, and it's the idea that Constantine didn't die, but rather had been turned into marble and hidden away by an angel, and at the right time would reemerge, kind of like King Arthur, and then finally drive the Turks away. So this is sort of, in the popular imagination, this sort of suggested that the siege wasn't over, it had just been paused, and that it would resume at a future time with a different outcome. It was a kind of apocalyptic fantasy. It was a tradition of that kind of thinking. There's a different version of this that was actually put forward in a Catalan novel just a few years after the siege. So this is the Catalan novel Tirant lo Blanc, which is the story of a chivalrous knight who is summoned or invited by the Emperor of Constantinople to help defend the city against the Turks. And he goes and does, successfully. So it's one of the first specimens of counterfactual historical fiction, and it's written soon after the siege. Now, others in the West had a different way of not accepting the outcome. For decades after 1453, popes and Catholic monarchs planned grand alliances to go and reconquer the city for Christendom and to reconstitute the Eastern Empire, under their own rule, of course. The title Emperor of Constantinople was passed down from monarch to monarch. Louis XIV claimed it at some point. So this is something that they kept in their back pocket. And afterwards, these grandiose plans were inherited by the Russian Empire. So from Catherine the Great in the late 18th century to Nicholas II during World War I, they contemplated and planned the city's reconquest for Orthodox Christianity. In fact, during the Great World War I, there was the Imperial Russian Army had charged one of its officers who was of Greek descent, and his job would be to put the cross back on the dome of Hagia Sophia once the city was taken. Now, the Russian Empire did not survive that war, and so that dream was briefly inherited by the modern Greek state for a very brief amount of time until the War of 1922 with the nascent Turkish Republic. Those dreams were crushed once and for all, and have been dead ever since. So it was not until then, and the treaties that were signed in the aftermath, that 1453 was in a certain sense finally recognized by the international community as a done thing. It was 100 years ago, almost exactly. So for Greeks today, the fall, or alosis, is more like ancient history. It's part of a fairly long history of national triumphs and failures. And I would say that sort of today laments about the fall of the city come mostly from sort of hyper-Orthodox or nationalist circles, usually by email. And they kind of induce eye-rolling. It is not a national holiday. 4 years ago, there was a small ceremony. This is the president of the Greek democracy, who's the woman in white. This is at Mistras, which is a very small town near Sparta. And on the 29th of May, 2021, there was a ceremony there where a wreath was laid before a statue of Constantine XI at Mistras, because this was it's a wonderful site. This is a Byzantine city with lots of churches. This is where he ruled the Peloponnese before he became the emperor in Constantinople. So for a few years in the 1440s, and before that, he'd been very active there for a long time. Notice the cosplay, the women standing on either side of the statue. Seems to be sort of mandatory. I'll show you some greater examples of this. It is, in fact, only in the Peloponnese that we have a contemporary portrait of Constantine, but this is as emperor, so probably after he had left. And I first became aware of this year. I think this is when I don't know that it's been sort of formally published. The F4 of Antiquities there kindly sent me these images. I mean, they're very available online. You can see the eagle on his breast there. So this is a relatively conventional image of a East Roman emperor of this time. I was able to repay her kindness with a small bit of information. So her name is Anastasia Koumousi, and I told her, you know that Constantine's treasurer was named Andronikos Koumousis, so same name, and she, no, I didn't. I mean, he died in the siege fighting, so it's, you know, should look into it. Maybe you can find a connection. Now, 1453 resonates much more powerfully in modern Turkey and more emotionally. In Istanbul, it's celebrated as sort of Conquest Day, Fetih, since 1953, which was the 500th anniversary. And it is accompanied by stirring rhetoric and a lot more cosplay, focusing especially on janissaries. They're like they're the ones who first broke through the walls on that morning. But there are also films and novels and a special panoramic museum. It's very interesting, sort of immersive images. You can go stand like in the siege. Now, it's rather unusual for a modern nation state to celebrate the military conquest of its imperial predecessor, especially events that happened, 500 or 600 years ago. And this is not a tradition that dates back to Ottoman times. It's very much a modern kind of event. And outsiders, especially Orthodox observers, see in this perhaps sort of like Christian-Muslim kinds of tensions, but in fact, they probably have much more to do with tensions within Turkish politics between the more secular and the Islamist side of the political spectrum. What I find interesting is that the kind of defensive tones of the celebrations, they kind of betray a curious anxiety about whether the conquest sort of really took the first time around, and it has to be sort of ritually reenacted to create reassurance and confirmation. I'll explain later on about why I think this is happening. But it's kind of Istanbul is a city that sort of symbolically reconquers itself every year through these anniversaries, and also through the conversion of churches, right? So either from churches or mosques into, museums into mosques. And this is also an imitation of the conqueror. So Mehmet, that's his name in the tradition, Mehmet the Conqueror. So it's almost as if the tenacity of the defenders in 1453 and the tragedy that befell them, it still kind of exerts a moral force that has to be periodically redefeated. Now, reenacting the siege is, of course, also common in publishing. Sort of countless novels and popular histories dedicated to the gripping story of those 2 months during which the city was bombarded. So these ancient walls built in the 5th century are being bombarded with this new technology, these cannons in the 15th century. And I'm about to pile on to that sort of publishing industry with my own book telling the history of the siege. As I dug into the bibliography, what I found very interesting is that, in fact, the story of the siege hasn't been reconstructed sort of in detail from the sources almost on a day-to-day basis since 1965. Stephen Runciman wrote a wonderful book. But it is over 60 years old and very outdated. And I also found that I disagreed with one of the core premises of the narrative, which is, this is Runciman's view, and it has been repeated ever since in all of the accounts, which is that the defense was doomed. And I found exactly the opposite was the case. And so when his chapter is Fading Hope, he means for the defenders, but it's very clearly for the Sultan. Right? So I found that the defense had successfully managed to counter all of Mehmed's admittedly brilliant stratagems. They knew what they were doing, and they were not looking to be martyred. This is not what this is not what they were doing. This is rather realistic expectation that they would be able to hold the city. And what Mehmed had to do was to very methodically increase their exposure to risk as much as possible through his resources. And he did this very successfully, and it paid off. But it paid off only at the end, and it was also a great risk for him. I'll explain why. But it required a whole reassessment of the military strategies on both sides. Remember, the defense has an army of about 8,000, which is not enough really to hold a city, in a population that at the time was between 35 and 50,000. Right? So how did they think that they could beat an army? The army was larger than the entire population of the city, but probably 10 times larger than the force that they had. So how did they think they can do that? Well, that is an analysis that I will leave for the book. So it'll come out sometime next year. For the rest of this talk, I want to focus on the experience of people who were captured, to explain a little bit about how it was possible for the city to be emptied out so quickly, and then a little bit about the impact of the fall. So less about the passage to modernity that I promised in the title before I had written the talk. Now, I mentioned the relative size of the two armies because it helps us to understand precisely how the attackers were able to round everybody up in about 9 hours. They did not need 3 days. Quite simply, there were more people in Mehmed's camp than there were inside the city. And this is sort of one of the paradoxes of the city in this phase of its history. By the way, most of the maps that you find online, including this one, are inaccurate in one way or another. I'm showing this only so that you get a sense of the relative, the position of the city of Constantinople within the growing Ottoman Empire. Constantinople in the 15th century is a very interesting place, and it's just full of paradoxes. The fact that you can have a besieging army that has more people in it than the entire population of the city is kind of rare. But it's also a very vibrant place, even though it's mostly empty. I mean, this is a city that once had 500,000 people living in it, and it now has less than a tenth. It's also yet bustling with trade. I'll explain why in a moment. It was a capital with no empire. It was both a capital and a frontier at the same time. The area inside the walls was full of fields, many of them cultivated. There were orchards that grew right next to imperial monuments that had been standing for over 1,000 years. It was poor, but also a place where incredible wealth was generated, especially for and by Italians who had these very dense trade routes that passed through from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. I think I have, yeah. The red is mostly Venetian holdings, the gray is Genoese. I'll explain. So the city itself is materially poor, but a great deal of wealth is passing through, and a few of the inhabitants of the city are managing to tap into those trade networks and become sort of junior partners, and they also become wealthy by the standards of their own society. And so we do have this interface at the top between fairly wealthy Greeks/Romans and the Italians. But even though the city itself was relatively poor in material terms, it had this incomparable cultural tradition that drew people to it from all around. So pilgrims came to venerate icons and relics and visit the churches. But also in this period, we have very many Italians who are coming to Constantinople in order to learn Greek and study classical scholarship. And there's also a great deal of trade passing through, as I mentioned. And so for all of these reasons, Constantinople was still situated as a kind of cultural hub. And so there are lots of different kinds of interesting people there all the time. And this is in part why we have all of these different eyewitness accounts that are written in all of these different languages. It's also a city that's more multicultural in a way than it ever was. So there are Italian and Roman, local, and Turkish coins circulating in its economy. And pretty much everybody can speak a little bit of the other languages in addition to the main ones, so Greek, Italian, and Turkish. In fact, Gennadios Scholarios, whom I mentioned a moment ago, who would become the first patriarch after the fall, there's a work in which he's defending himself against being sort of too Latin, too Catholic, because he knows Latin. And he says, if that were the case, he says, by that logic, we're all Muslims because we all use their language as well. Now, I said that there were more people in the camp than in the city. So Mehmed had maybe 60,000 soldiers. The sources say he had 300 or 400,000. That's just impossible. So when you see those kinds of numbers, you can say, okay, they're not helpful. I can't work with these numbers. Realistically, it could not have been more than 60. And if we add the sailors in the fleet, a very large fleet that he brought to invest the city, and the logistical, religious, and support personnel, and if we add in a few thousand people who were there to help out in sacking the place when it fell, we might reach something like 100,000. And almost all of them were men between 16 and 45. The total population of the Ottoman Empire at this time, including the vassal states that were required to send soldiers, is something like 8 million. This means that something over 1% of the population of the empire is there, right? That's over 2% of the male population. And if you figure that at pre-modern standards, about 40% of the male population is under 16. That means that there's about 5% of the adult male population of this entire empire is present outside the walls or in the ships in the harbor. And then there are the animals. So Contemporary says that the Turks bring as many camels and mules as they can for their supplies and their convenience. Large markets follow the Sultan, supplying whatever is needed for the horses, slaves, and the army. So a great multitude of people are present there too. Now, these lines that you see here, these trade routes, one of the main commodities that is being traded at this time are slaves. And the Ottoman Empire is tapped into these trade routes, working with the Venetians and the Genoese in the slave trade. So in fact, the Ottoman conquests at this time, this is an expanding, growing state, it generates many of the slaves who are then traded on these routes. And the routes are operated by Italians. So there are always slavers present with the armies wherever they're going and conquering, and certainly outside of Constantinople. The Venetians have a presence in Constantinople on the south side, on the harbor. I'll show you a map of the city in a moment. The Genoese actually have their own outpost. It's a place called Galatas or Pera, which is right across the Golden Horn. It's connected by bridges today, but that was literally like their own branch office of Genoa. Right? Now, these are just the people who were directly involved in the siege. In pre-modern economies, it usually takes something like the agricultural labor of 8 or 9 people to produce enough surplus to sustain one person who doesn't work the land directly or with animals or in some sort of primary production. Therefore, the surplus production of about 1 million people is being used to, let's say, feed that 100,000 that was encamped outside the walls. So that's 1/8 of the, 1 out of 8 people are working to produce food and so on for that army. And that's just the food. The economic impact of this army was even greater if you factor in pay and equipment, ships, siege engines, cannons, and so forth. In other words, the siege of Constantinople was a massive logistical, demographic, and economic undertaking that, in one way or another, impacted just about everyone in this part of the world. Right? And this partly explains the stress that Mehmet was under to wrap this up quickly, and why 2 months was seeming to more and more people in his camp as a prolonged failure. This had to be done quickly, because if you think about the cost of it, it explains his furious determination to find every possible way to break in, which he did. And on the part of his soldiers, the goal was not to burst in and kill people. No, it's the exact opposite. It's to round them up and take them as slaves and sell them or keep them. So there's actually very little killing once they break through in the walls. They're actually very good at rounding up people in this way. They work in teams. They post their unit banners outside of homes or monasteries where they're capturing. So this tells other parts of the invading army, this is ours, you go look elsewhere. They're very coordinated when it comes to this. We know that a few hundred people managed to escape on that day on the Italian ships that were in the harbor. So the harbor is the Golden Horn there. You see it's one of the best natural harbors in the Mediterranean. And these are mostly Italians. Now, many of them were natives of the city because they're, like Venetian and Genoese colonies there. Others were just there on business when the city fell. And the Constantine asked the Italians who were there to stay and help to defend the city. And to their credit, they did. And he entrusted the defense of the harbor to them, which makes sense. So Venetian galleys at this point are unbeatable. Put differently, there was no number of ships that the Turks could throw at Venetian galleys and seriously have a chance to harm them. And this happened a few times. It's not an equal fight. So he entrusts the defense of the harbor to the Venetians. He also entrusts the defense of his own palace, Lachernae, which is at the northern tip there that you see, to the Venetians. And the most critical sector of the land wall defense, which is a point where the walls kind of dip and are virtually gone today because that's where all the bombardment was concentrated. He entrusted to the leadership of the defense, to the leadership of a Genoese mercenary, Giustiniani, and he was also stationed there too, Constantine was. So when people are rushing to the ships and they set them, they start to leave the harbor, these galleys are missing many of their sort of captains and crew, and they're just kind of limping out into the sea. And meanwhile, the residents of the city are beginning to pile up on the docks. A pitiful sight, wrote one of our sources, with men, women, monks, and nuns all wailing and asking to be taken on board, but the ships had already left. There's no way, unless they had their own ships, they couldn't get to them. There's one Florentine who was there, a fellow called Tetaldi, and he says that he continued to fight on the walls for 2 hours after the city had fallen, at which point he went to the harbor, took his clothes off, and swam out to the galleys, and that's how he escaped. And we find out later from records in Venice and Crete that he also had a 12-year-old Russian slave with him named Valentino, who must have gone with him, but he doesn't mention him anyway. So the Sultan's first concern is to arrest the political leadership of the city, which he does. He kind of puts out warrants for their arrest in a certain sense. So his soldiers are bringing these people. Is this the guy you want? Is this the guy you want? And so he rounds up most of the political leadership. There's some debate in his court about what to do with the city, and they decide to execute all of them. So these are most of the emperor's his council, his advisors, his officials. including the leading Venetian official who had led the defense of the palace, and some Catalans who were there. I'm still not sure exactly why the Catalans, but anyway. One person that he really wanted to find was Cardinal Isidore, I mentioned, who was the main link between Constantinople and the Catholic West. So if any help were to come from the West, he would be the link. And in fact, Isidore had been captured and enslaved and spent days in the camps outside the city. But he wasn't recognized, at least not by his captors, and partly possibly because he had a bandage on his head because he had been shot in the face during the chaos of that day. But it seems that probably some Genoese recognized him and ransomed him cheaply because they knew who he was, but his captors didn't know. It's some old man, and, you know, so he was very lucky in that way. And then he spent a few days in Pera or Galatas, which is that outpost that you see right across there. So that's a Genoese city, essentially a separate city, which had remained neutral during the siege, which meant that it was helping both sides. Now, remember, he's a cardinal, so he's the highest ranking Catholic prelate in this part of the world, right? So the Genoese definitely have an interest to ransom him. So I'm going to quote here from an account of how he got away from the city, which was written by someone he knew on Crete. So he ends up on the island of Crete, where he starts sending letters to the West about what had happened. These are some of our main sources. But he has a secretary there, and he wrote this. So at Pera, he hid for 8 days, secretly moving from house to house. Now, he knows that the Sultan is looking for him. But it was not safe for him to stay there. So he boarded a Turkish galley and stayed on board for 3 days as far as Prusa, as Bursa in Asia Minor. And he pretended to be an impoverished man who had been captured and then ransomed and was seeking to ransom his sons, who were also captured in Constantinople. So he's pretending to be a kind of person who must have been very common after the siege, going around begging for money to ransom the rest of his family. Okay. Gradually, he attached himself to a Turk with whom he reached a place called Focia, and then certain Genoese recognized him and inadvertently revealed his identity. So he became anxious because this region belonged to the Turks, and so he boarded a small boat to Chios, which is owned by the Genoese at this time, and next he went to Crete, where he is in residence trying to recover as of last July 8th. So this raises the question of who was likely to be ransomed in the aftermath and who not. Right? So wealthy Latins had an overwhelming advantage here, especially if they could access funds or loans from other Italians in Galatas. And this appears to be how Isidore himself was ransomed. Now keep away, he can maintain this disguise because he is a sort of ethnic Greek, or Romeos, so he can pass. But he's also a high-ranking Catholic priest, and so there was probably a priority to ransom him as quickly as possible. So too his friend, Leonardo of Chios, who's another Genoese, and he is the bishop of Mytilene, so the island of Lesbos. And he was also captured and beaten, enslaved, later ransomed. We don't know exactly how. By the way, this process is not something that they wanted to talk about very much afterwards. They're far more likely to mention that they had been captured and enslaved and spent time in the camps and how badly they were treated, but not to tell us about how they were ransomed. That is the part that almost none of them speak about. And it's possible because this creates sort of uncomfortable relationships of dependence with the other Christians who did ransom them. Anyway, who literally bought them. That's how you ransom people, right? There's one case we know, there's a poet, Posculo, who's in the city learning Greek and had been there, and he's got caught by the siege. And he was also captured and spent a year as a slave, at which point he was ransomed. And one of the Venetians, I think, Gritti, who helped to ransom him a year later. So Posculo is one of our sources for the siege, which he wrote in this like Virgilian Latin poem about the siege in 4 books. It's very, And he gives this person a special heroic attention, like he's performing heroic feats in the defense. And like nobody else mentions this person. But this must have been a way of sort of thanking him and paying him back for intervening. Now, captive Latins could hope for some help from overseas. So the Senate in Venice authorized some funds to release their own citizens, to buy them back. And so many Venetians were ransomed in the next year, and they returned home. The wealthiest, of course, commanded the largest ransoms. The Republic also set up processes for reimbursing their citizens who had incurred great losses during the siege, such as having to pay their crews for the 2 months or the loss of cargo. And it also authorized banks who had accounts held by people who were captured to use those funds in order to track them down and ransom them, or their heirs if they had died. As you probably never imagined that your bank would come to the rescue if you ever captured and held hostage, but it worked. So many people were ransomed using their own money. Because, no, for real, the banks have a sort of fiduciary duty to ensure that they're paying interest. They didn't know who to pay the interest to, and this is why they went looking for the people. Now, the Greeks, by contrast, are in a very different situation. And from now on, I'm going to call them Romans, because that's what they were. As the population had been enslaved, and their property was forfeit to the soldiers, or to the Sultan, because the Sultan, in theory, owns the physical infrastructure of any place that's captured. Anything movable, the soldiers can take. So there was no one in the immediate vicinity to ransom them, right? Now, okay, maybe you have some wealthy Genoese friends at Pera, but, you know. What you could appeal to wealthy ethnic Romans at the Sultan's court, and there are many, because the Ottoman Empire at this point already includes the vast majority of Greek speakers in the world. And the sultans run a sort of, you know, multilingual, multi-ethnic kind of operation where they're using lots of different people in high places to liaise with various kinds of groups and perform different functions. Many of those people are Orthodox or Roman, and so there were lots of appeals to these people at the Sultan's court, and they helped out. Ironically, the majority of the captured Romans were sort of, in a sense, ransomed by the Sultan. He's entitled to a fifth of the movable property, also slaves. So the next day he goes to the camps and he picks out the sort of best-looking boys, girls, men, and women for himself, a fifth of them. And he sends 40 handsome lads and pretty girls as a gift to the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, but he keeps the rest for himself. And he also resettles that part of the population back into the city and along the harbor. So this is if there are, like, let's say 35,000 who are captured, this is 1/5 of that are immediately put back. But imagine the sort of dizzying change of fortune here, because so you're living in one part of the city, and then there's a siege, and you're captured, and you're taken out to the camps where you spend 3 or 4 days, and then you're relocated back into the city, essentially as kind of like property of the Sultan, but in a completely different place, a different house, different neighbors, other people coming in. This was very chaotic. And in fact, we have a church official, Orthodox church official, Agalianos, and he says that the city is now this Tower of Babel, he calls it, where nobody knows anybody anymore. So part of his job was to sort of monitor, like, marriages and ensure that Orthodox marriages are taking place according to canon law. And this was chaos for him, because people were coming back without their own wives. Sometimes they were coming back with the wives of others. Some people were just completely alone. Families had been broken up. Spouses were lost. And the survivors are forming, unions, and then suddenly a wife shows up or a husband shows up, and it's just, he's a bureaucrat, so the rules of marriage have been destroyed. One example, the family of Sfanzis. Sfanzis is a high official or advisor of the emperor, and his family had been broken up in this way. So he had been captured and ransomed. He doesn't tell us by whom. And he made his way to the Peloponnese. His wife and children, however, remained in captivity. And so he's trying from a distance to free them. And he says that they at first belonged to some, quote, elderly and good Turks. But then they were sold to Ilyas Bey, who was the chief of the Sultan's stables. And he was, quote, making good money from them. This is probably through sex work. And, quote, as the beauty and charms of my children could not be kept secret, they were purchased by the Sultan himself. Now, the Sultan also has a political interest in gathering up the families of former high officials, because these are the kinds of people who might cause trouble in the aftermath. You know, he doesn't know that someone might be planning, some sort of revolution. And so this left the mother alone with the daughter. But in December 1453, so just a bit later, the Sultan personally executes Franzis' son Ioannis, who is 14, on the grounds that he had attempted to kill him. What that means exactly. So Franzis and others spent years trying to track down their family. I will remind you what Isidore was, his disguise when he was leaving the city. It was precisely this, right? That made sense, that you're just trying to gather money to ransom your family. Most enslaved Romans had no choice but to endure their lot. They were dispersed along with the army to wherever, the soldiers came from in Anatolia or elsewhere in the Balkans. And so very few were liberated. But I spent some time trying to track down those that we can. So for example, there is the scholar Michail Apostolis, and he was captured and spent 37 days on a galley, sort of rowing, and then he was ransomed, he doesn't say how, and then he eventually makes his way to Crete, where he makes a living, sort of eking out a living by copying classical manuscripts for Italian patrons. And we have some of those manuscripts. And if you're a classicist here, it is very possible that some ancient Greek author you work on, the critical edition is in part based on the work that Apostolis was doing on Crete. He's a very good copyist. And he would sign his manuscripts, and I found one where he signs as Michail Apostolios, a Constantinopolitan captured in war by the Huns, living in poverty, copied this book for money. Just pretty blunt. Another refugee from Constantinople is Dimitrios Leondaris. He is the scion of a leading Roman political family. His grandfather had once been the leading general of the empire. Yeah, it didn't have many soldiers at that point, but this one had been trained as a scribe. Now, I don't know where he was during the siege, but immediately afterwards he was tracking down his wife, Efrosini, and he was trying to obtain her release. Now, she had been captured and enslaved too. In early 1555, so a couple years later, Leondaris is in Edirne, or Adrianople, which is kind of the, quote, capital, or sort of forward operating base, or whatever, of the Ottomans at this time, because she was being held there. Now, Efrosini, his wife, is the daughter of the city's last governor, who's Dimitrios Paleologos Metochitis. So it is likely that she is also one of these sort of high-value political captives that the Sultan is keeping. So on the 30th of March, 1455, Leondaris wrote a comment in a manuscript, and the comment is the right-hand column in this manuscript. The manuscript is a text of a psalm commentary, and it had an empty column, and so he filled it in with his story. As you can see, it's a beautiful hand. He is well-trained as a scholar and a scribe. And he wrote there that his wife had died 2 weeks after being released and was buried in Adrianople. And she left me with 4 children, he wrote, a 6-year-old boy and 3 girls. And so Leondaris here, he pities his evil fate, and he entrusts himself to God, and eventually he also emigrates to the West, where he made a living copying ancient texts. But there are captives who returned, who faced other kinds of problems. So for example, there's one, Dionysios, who was a candidate for the throne of the Patriarchate in Constantinople in the next decade. And he was required to lift his robes and show his genitals to prove that he had not converted to Islam while he was a captive. So there are quite interesting stories about what people had to go through, what they went through, and just a sort of shock of your life sort of falling apart and then having to reconstitute it in a world, a very different world. So now I've mentioned a few survivors who made a living working for Italian humanists in this way, and that's how we know them, because they leave books behind, and so this is a very small part of the population. So I wanted to talk a little bit, by way of conclusion, about the impact, the sort of historical impact of the fall of the city. And there's a lot that could be said here, so I'm going to limit myself to a few points. So the fall of Constantinople very quickly acquired a tremendous symbolic significance. Historians, scholars, writers were connecting it to all kinds of transformations taking place at the time. And even in retrospect, its significance in this sense continued to grow. So, for example, it emerged so within a century of historical discussion as a kind of marker for the end of the Middle Ages, and is still used that way in textbooks and even specialized studies. But it also it signals the transition of the Ottoman Empire from a sort of frontier, nomadic emirate to a more settled administrative state. And it also highlighted the emergence of what are now called the Islamic gunpowder empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavids, the Mughals in India, and so on. So they dominate South Asia for quite a few centuries. In fact, Mehmed was the first to show what you can actually accomplish with cannons in a spectacular way. Even though he was still using kind of outdated cannon technology, so bronze, but it was, this was very impressive. Looking even to the West, 1453 is also the year of the end of the 100 Years' War between England and France. And one scholar has recently claimed that 1453 marked the start of modern European geopolitics, right? With the collapse of the empire in the East, followed shortly thereafter by the collapse of the English Empire in France. Right? So these two events had profound consequence for Europe as a whole, and especially for the Holy Roman Empire. Because the German Empire, because this now picked up the mantle of having to defend Europe from Ottoman expansion. So there is a kind of emerging modern geopolitical framework that is linked to 1453. And in some respects, not at a distance either. So for example, I've mentioned the Genoese and the Venetians here. So the Venetians opted in the aftermath to wage a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire, which is astonishing that a sort of merchant republic in Italy can do this against the Ottoman Empire. And I think they lost every one. I mean, it did not work out for them. But that they could do it at all is impressive. The Genoese, much less a centralized state than Venice, their interests gradually shifted toward the Western Mediterranean, and in fact, outside the Mediterranean. And there have been studies showing how Genoese merchants gradually disinvested from those trade routes that I showed you and shifted them to the west and out into the Atlantic. And in fact, some of the same people. We can track their career trajectories. So the Genoese push into the Atlantic, Christopher Columbus and so forth, is in some respects sort of closely connected to developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. But I want to make some points that go beyond a purely symbolic level and just point out some actual consequences of the city's fall. And I'll start with the conquerors. So I mentioned that this is a kind of inflection point whereby the Ottoman Empire sort of moves from being a kind of nomadic emirate that's expanding to a more settled administrative centralized state, quite centralized in some respects. Before 1453, the sultans were like always on campaign, almost all the time. But afterwards, especially after the reign of Mehmed himself, they begin to settle down much more until the sultans become sort of essentially confined to the palace. And there were actually forces that were fearful of this development at the time, especially the Ottoman frontier warlords, who preferred the old model and did not want a centralized bureaucratic state running their operations or taxing them or whatever. So there was actually opposition to taking Constantinople and using it as a capital in this way. But Constantinople itself, it had a way of pulling the conquerors in. I mean, Mehmed had created a void there, which I described, and that void sucked him in. And that void requires palaces, and it requires a large population. And so one of his main priorities was to try to get people there and build up the population again. And then it requires investment in sort of ceremonial and all stuff like that. So in a certain sense, the city itself prevails in the long run. I mean, it's one of these very, very few places that served as the capital of two sequential empires. Let me get that back up. All right. I got it. How was that? And in a certain sense, the fact, so Isidore I mentioned, who the cardinal who escaped to Crete, and in one of his letters to the Pope, so reporting to his boss, he says the city is now going to become Turkopolis. But that didn't happen. Right? It didn't happen. It remained Constantinople down to the 20th century. The name wasn't sort of formally changed to Istanbul until the 20th century, the early 20th century, and the formation of the Turkish Republic. And in part, that's because its very prestige as an object of conquest in Islamic tradition for a millennium before that had been its name, right, to conquer Constantinople. And so you wanted to keep it. The same is true for Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia has also kept its name, even as a mosque. It's a Hagia Sophia mosque, right? It's the only church in Constantinople that kept its name. And again, it's because it's a prestige object that you kind of want to highlight in keeping it, that you have conquered it, right? And I think this is kind of the origin of this phenomenon where the city has to be symbolically reconquered, because the value of the city and of Hagia Sophia are to a considerable degree reside in the fact that they were objects of conquest for so long. Put differently, in a sense, Constantinople, in some respect, also conquered the Ottoman Empire. Right? All right, let's look at the conquered very briefly. 1453 marked the end of an imperial monarchy that had begun with the reign of Caesar Augustus. This, a millennium and a half earlier, this is, by this point, the oldest state in history. The Roman polity was the longest surviving state, and I think this is an issue that my field needs to explore a little bit more, not just looking at moments of decline, but to try to explain this incredible longevity. All empires fall, but I think this one merits a special place in the annals of survival. One of the historians of the fall, Kaldellis, writing in Greek, but a biography of the Sultan, he says that this marked the end of the greatest and oldest state of all that we know. Now, the fall of Constantinople materially impacted how the East Roman tradition would be perceived and studied in the West thereafter, right? And I think this is important because even at the end, even in its kind of impoverished state, Constantinople was still a free city. It had its own native rulers, where all East Roman traditions were preserved and cultivated in the way that its people saw fit. These include their version of Greek Orthodoxy. It includes their study of the classical tradition, and it includes their Roman identity. So Roman voices still had a place there. They still had a state, a weak one. And it's quite possible that their claims to their history and their traditions would not have been able to prevail over Western perceptions and Western scholarship. But I think that the difference between having no voice and having a small one is like infinite, right? And one casualty of 1453 was this East Roman tradition of classical scholarship, which, as someone in a classics department, is something that interests me a lot. Like, how do we get from, you know, classical antiquity to today? And this is a major part of the story on the Greek side. Until 1453, this was a center of learning. I mean, the Italians went there to get all of the ancient texts, to learn the grammar, to learn Greek, and so forth. Afterwards, the city ceases to produce classical scholars who have a native relationship to the language. And what this enables Western European scholars to do within a generation, maybe a little bit later, is that they essentially have to reinvent classical Greek scholarship on their own terms. They're no longer being taught by native Greek speakers, and they construct classical studies in an image that, you know, fits their values more. And you find this expressed in many textbooks, especially surveys of the classical tradition, which will say, yes, 1453 was a great tragedy, but it has a silver lining, where like, all of these scholars go to the West and they bring their manuscripts and whatever. That isn't entirely true. The manuscript flow had been flowing for some time. I mean, you didn't need to subject these people to this kind of ruination to get them to move to the West. But there's this narrative, right, that 1453 pushes these scholars to Italy and they learn Greek classics, and soon you have democracy and capitalism or whatever. And, in fact, the fall of the city was detrimental to classical studies in both the East and the West. So after 1500 in the West, you just don't have major representation by people who have, like I said, a native relationship to the language with some pretty distorting consequences. Some of them are the narratives that I mentioned. Another one is the pseudo-Erasmian pronunciation of ancient Greek, which is just the calamity and can never be used properly. But its purpose, I assure you, is, ostensibly to be more accurate. In reality, it creates a special sociolect for classicists so that they don't have to feel sort of contaminated by ethnic studies and like those people who, anyway. The 16th century texts on the pronunciation of ancient Greek are full of so much like anti-Greek prejudice about how those Greeks speak the language. It's incredible. But anyway, that's a topic for a different occasion. For my purposes, the real problem is that it enabled Western scholars to make up Byzantium however they wanted, with hardly any pushback from anyone who represents that culture. And as I said, the difference between having a small say and no say is infinite. After his experience of captivity, Apostoliis, the scholar I mentioned, he wrote to one of his Italian contacts and he says, well, he says, I'm just a mere remnant of a once great tradition, whereas you Italians are just now embarking on your own future. So for those who experienced it, the siege of Constantinople embodied and kind of pushed to its limits this relationship among Italians, Romans, and Turks in the 15th century. They could live at peace, and at many times they did, albeit unequally, and they had very different goals, of the Turks to conquer, of the Italians to profit, of the Romans to survive. And these asymmetries all collided during the siege. This event was shaped by the major forces of its time. These included imperialism and conquest, enslavement and captivity, migration, assimilation, cultural exchange, booming trade, classical studies, new technologies, and some fairly ancient religious disputes. And this was the context. But let's not forget, the real event was experienced by a few thousand men who, for 2 months, and under bombardment of cannons aimed against ancient walls, they struggled to survive or to conquer, and no theories about history were on their mind as they climbed and dodged and thrust, shouted, hacked, slipped, fell, bled, died. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please ask questions if you would like, and try to use the mic in the middle of the room there.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Hello, give me 1 second. Yes.
I was just wondering if you could speak more to the state of Hagia Sophia immediately after the conquest.
From what particular state?
Because you mentioned that the population was rounded up. I was just curious as to if that played a part in...
Yes, well, they actually made it a little bit easier to be rounded up precisely by going to Hagia Sophia. So I've looked very closely at those hours. Right. And after a certain point, people just began to go there because it was the obvious place to go. Hagia Sophia can fit a great many people. I've seen numbers up to 16,000, which, if true, would be about half the population at the time, or thereabouts, a bit less. And when the armies of the Sultan reached that point, they just started bringing everybody out in groups and tying them up. So that helped, in a sense, to clear the city out very quickly. Hagia Sophia had, it seems, been kept up pretty well. So they knew, so the emperors of Constantinople knew that this was a very important attraction. It was something that they were very proud of. And so they had, it seems, taken care to keep it up. But as soon as Mehmed arrives on that day, there's a Muslim prayer there, and in a certain sense, I don't know the legalities involved, but it sort of signified that it was to be a mosque. That must have been the plan. Beyond that, you're talking like architecturally, or?
I was just curious about those exact hours.
Yeah. Now, I mean, there's stories about some Turkish soldiers sort of hacking away and breaking the marble and things like that, but I'm always a bit cautious. These are told like 10 years afterwards, which is perhaps not that long by the standards of an ancient historian, right? But long enough that quite a few stories that are meant to make certain people look good or certain people look bad appear. So I would take those with a grain of salt. Anyway.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for this. Can you comment a little bit, especially in terms of the classical tradition, where the facts of Mehmed's death on his way to campaign for the conquest of Rome fits into this fits into the story of the fall of Constantinople as well? Because we've got all these interconnecting parts, especially of Mehmed's narrative of uniting the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to, there was an advance party set to Otranto in Italy. This is 30 years later. It's always been very difficult to interpret the strategy here. He kept his cards very close to the vest at all times. It's one thing that he had learned very early on from various experiences anyway, that just keep people guessing, always, including his own inner circle. So there were times when they wouldn't know exactly what the plan is. So we can't know. The plan to take Rome is something I think of a Western fear. Not that had the opportunity presented itself, I mean, this is an expanding empire, and sometimes you push against a territory or an enemy, and they're much, much weaker than you think, and they just collapse, and you just move in. Sometimes conquests can happen very quickly, sometimes not, and you don't know that until you try. So I don't think there was an actual plan to, and nor do I think it would have gotten very far. having said it.
That's sort of what I was asking, whether or not this has left some kind of residue in these fears as
Yes.
a classical tradition, a Western classical tradition narrative developed.
Yes. So in the West, there's just hysteria. And there's fear that the Ottomans are going to conquer, all of Western Europe, or they're coming for Italy or Rome next. And a lot of these narratives are written, depending on who's writing it, but I mentioned Postula, who's writing this Virgilian verse, right? Others are very self-consciously drawing on like the Urbs Capta motif, which is like writing about, like based on Troy, basically. What happens to a city when it's taken by the enemy after a long and bitter siege? And to lift a lot of those motifs. And so the Western imagination sort of populated the siege with all kinds of atrocities, some of which are just not even physically possible. But yes, sometimes the more sort of vernacular, less classicizing accounts are more reliable because they don't have like that whole apparatus of literature and the imagination to draw on, but not necessarily. So the classical sources are one of the main it's a medium that is used to produce accounts of the fall of Constantinople. The more so, the later you go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. Constantinople, of course, fell twice, and I'm wondering about, in your reading, the relationship between 1204 and 1453. And I love in your telling of the narrative, you're centering it around captivity and slave trade and the wider, that wider scene, whereas with 1204, the story is told about exile, right? So you have the exiles of that Latin conquest, which kind of sets up hopes for a reconquest. And I was thinking about that with the way you were talking about how the possibility of retaking Constantinople stayed alive for so long as a possibility, of course, with Crusade and everything else. And so I'm curious about how we frame these two together. Is it just about a different moment or different conquerors, or what?
That is a fascinating question. It's something I do think about sort of fairly often, not just the Roman Empire. So these are interestingly inverse phenomena, right? So in 1204, as you may know, there's this, the fleet of the Fourth Crusade sets out from Venice anyway. Eventually it makes its way to Constantinople, and call it a fluke or whatever, they happen to take the city. Not by breaking through the land walls, which no one had done, but by leveraging Venetian sort of marine landings on the sea walls. That's a wholly different kind of operation. The interesting thing is that attack took the capital before the territorial state. Territorial state was still there, and remnants of it regrouped, and were able to take back the capital eventually. In the Ottoman case, it's exactly the inverse. The territories had all been taken, and only Constantinople remained. And in part, the Ottomans could not replicate what the Venetians had done. They didn't even have the naval skills to even try it. And so it had to be land. And had it not been for the cannons, I think, right, that it would not have gotten very far. It's not the first time they tried. Right? But there's a major difference, again, I think, between having a little and having nothing. So after 1204, the Romans had not just a little, they had quite a bit, and they used it as leverage in order to regroup. Remember, these kinds of societies, medieval and ancient societies, ultimately their resources are generated from surplus production, agriculture. So you need land. If you don't have land, you're not going to manage to do very much. Venice is, in a certain sense, the first state in this part of the world to try it, to amass power that's not necessarily based on command of land, though they had plenty of that too. So the regrouping that happens after 1204 is a native one. The regrouping that happens, insofar as it happens, and it doesn't really eventually happen at all, after 1453, is a foreign one, it's a Western one. And it's largely of the imagination. I think if you were to put on one hand dreams of reconquering Constantinople, titles right? You know, writing of histories and all of this. And on the other hand, actual organizational planning, I think it would tilt very much on the more fantasy side. Yeah. And what's interesting is that when they think about retaking Constantinople, like all of these German emperors and popes and whatever, they think of it in terms of the lost ancient Eastern Roman Empire as an abstraction that is not linked to the people who currently live in it. It's just the Eastern Empire. Like, whose empire exactly? Like, what are you going to do with it? We'll worry about that. Because the important thing is always for the Western lords to work out the problems of who's going to own what. And then we'll worry about actually getting our hands on it. So there's a lot of that, yeah. There's a lot of fantasy about Constantinople.
So I was kind of curious, you spoke a little bit during the presentation, also while answering the questions, kind of about the reaction that the fall of Constantinople inspired in the West, like this kind of hysteria, but also this like willing to reconquer. And I was curious a little bit, how far east did the story go? And then what kind of reaction then did it kind of inspire in the East, in like, say, I don't know, Central Asia or Iran or the Arab countries? You spoke a little about how it was like venerated to a sense, it was like inspiring, but I would be curious about a little bit deeper about that.
So I'm not the person to ask. I haven't looked farther than like Egypt, and because there's correspondence, it's a more settled state, it's in communication. Once you start going east here, at this time, you enter into a very unsettled situation where there are all of these, I don't know what these are, nomadic or whatever, sort of Turkish nomadic states that are being formed and that form and fall within sort of rapid succession. White sheep, black sheep, and so forth. And I'm not sure that they're thinking about Constantinople or anything like that at this time. I have found these, there's some sort of literature very impenetrable to try to get at them, and I managed to find a history that's written by, I think it's in connection with I think it's the White Sheep Turks. But anyway, and so here's this text. I mean, it's written in like Arabic script, and I asked a colleague who is like a Persian, and she said, I can't read, like it's like third Turkish, a third Arabic, a third Persian, and what is this? And I'm like, no, never mind. So, but it is on my mind. Like, I would really like to know. It's just hard to assess.
Thank you.
Hi, so first of all, I want to thank you for the talk, but I had some questions regarding the Genoese and the Venetian forces, and particularly why they would defend the city in the capacity of their trading with both. I mean, you frame them in the context of profit as their main obligations, so like besides the religious obligations, like what other obligations they have to the city of Constantinople and its defense?
That's a great question. So it's all right, bit of background. The reason why these routes are so profitable for them is because they've managed to bully and extort concessions of tax-free trading through the city of Constantinople. Right? That is a major, look at where it's situated. That's, if you were to pick one hub here, well, if you're Venetian and you needed to pick two hubs, you would pick exactly the ones that they have. It's Constantinople and Crete, right? So what Constantinople, this is a long story, it goes back to quite some time. Remember, the Venetians had actually quasi-owned Constantinople for 50-some years in the 13th century. And they never forgot it. They never actually formally dropped from their title, the Doge, the Lord of a quarter and an eighth of the Roman Empire. And their tax exemptions, okay, I don't want to say that they're fighting for their tax exemptions, but it's a major part of their calculation. So the Venetians had actually fought with Constantine because he wanted to tax Venetian taverns, like the wine drinking in the city, just a tiny little bit, because he had almost no money. But they certainly know that if Constantinople falls into the hands of the Turks, all that goes away, which it does, right? And that they might be entirely excluded from the Black Sea. Now, the Black Sea is, I mean, look at it. There's like only one place through which you can access it, and it is that, like by sea, right? And in fact, it had been a closed zone until 1204. The emperors in Constantinople did not allow the Italians access to trade there. After taking the city in 1204, the Latins had opened up the Black Sea to their trade. So they don't know whether they will even continue to have access to that. So there is major opportunities that are at risk here if the Ottomans were to succeed, in addition to strategic ones, which I could go on. But so having Constantinople as a naval base, which essentially they could if they wanted to, and had used it that way many times, it means that you can cut the Ottoman Empire in half, right? Look at it. And in fact, they had done so within living memory. Because the sultans have to cross that body of water. And it's not a very wide body of water, but you still have to cross it. And if you have Venetian galleys patrolling it, you can't. Or Genoese or whatever. Actually, the sultans hired the Genoese to ferry them across. This did not work very well for the Genoese image in the West. I think they called them the Mongols, whatever. Anyway, Constantinople represented a lot of valuable, assets that they didn't want to give up, and opportunities, which eventually they did have to, and they knew that.
First and foremost, thank you for the talk. It was amazing and really insightful. I just wanted to ask a question about sort of, I don't know if this is the correct terminology to use in the 15th century, but sort of the demographic and ethnic character of the city after the siege, because it seems that the entire population was just evacuated and it was sort of resettled. In sort of the 100 or 200 years after, like 1453, did most of the Greek evacuees, the original population of the city, return? Does it become mostly Turkish and Ottoman just because of the fact that it became the capital of the empire? I'm just sort of curious to sort of what happened there in terms of the character of the city after it.
Yeah, that's a great question. No, based on what I have found, I would not put too much emphasis on continuity there. But Mehmet was really keen to repopulate the place after a certain point. And he brought mixed population, mixed groups there. So you start to find, within a few decades, I think there's an Armenian community, like an actual distinct group that it had never been there before. But also many Greek speakers from other parts of his empire. So moving forward into Ottoman times, it is a very mixed city. I think possibly the majority would be Muslim, though ethnically that means a lot of different things. Many Greek speakers, like in Asia Minor, are converting to Islam in this period in very large numbers. We know that many of the sort of elite of the Ottoman Empire are converted Greek, Serbs, whatever. Even some Venetians. I mean, there are opportunities to be had there. So, religion and ethnicity and even language, they don't necessarily map on. But I think that it would have been my majority Muslim from that point on. I think the Greek-speaking component, or Orthodox Greek-speaking population would have been the single largest after that, and remains so for centuries. Single largest, not the largest. Yeah. After the majority. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I just wanted to clarify a point about where you speak about the loss of hope for the conquerors, not the conquered. You mentioned that Mehmet's worried about this kind of sucking in of resources that the siege has. Do we have evidence of actual unrest or even revolt over people revolting over all these resources being taken and shipped towards the siege? You mentioned eight farmers sustaining just one soldier. Or is this something that he's just worried about, or does it actually happen?
No, it doesn't actually happen. In 2 months, I don't think that's enough time for discontent to build in the camp. We know there was discontent. He was under pressure from even some of his sort of spiritual advisors to start punishing people for various failures. For discontent to build in the camps to such a degree that this gets out in the provinces to organize a whatever. We do know that the sultans at any time, and especially Mehmet, was always worried about provincial rebellions, and with good reason. So this is something that you can just assume is on in the background of the calculations. The longer this drags on, because remember, this is about you have to remove garrisons from places in the provinces to have an army of that size. It's not that you can sustain this sort of thing indefinitely. And that weakens your presence there. He had to have this wrapped up. So the problem is not so much that the conquered populations would rebel. I mean, maybe they would, but that it would be invaded from the west. That was the biggest fear, like another crusading army. Now, this was not very likely after the failure of the Varna Crusade, which was like a decade earlier. But he doesn't know how many armies are waiting to march. Right, in the West, that Hungary might be a problem. Venice might send more ships. Look, by my calculations, 2 more ships with mercenaries would have tipped the balance in the defense of the walls. That's all that was really necessary. The Venetians couldn't get their act together fast enough to send 2 ships. They dragged their feet about sending help. They really were upset about that tax on the wine. I'm not kidding. This was a major point of controversy between Constantine and Venice. And so they sent some ships, but they by the time they got to the Aegean, the news was coming out that... So 2 months was just about fast enough that those kinds of problems didn't appear. Unless I'm forgetting something. I mean, and it's not just... problems in the Balkans, but Karaman, which is another emirate in Asia Minor, was always causing problems. And this is what happened to his father. His father had besieged Constantinople, and he had to, just leave because there was trouble in the provinces.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to probably have to end the question and answer period, but there is a reception following this event just next door, so you can ask questions further. But let me just conclude by letting you all know that first of all, thank you so much for. Thank you, Anthony, for this great talk. I'm always incredibly overwhelmed by the richness of the Lynn Center annual lectures, and this is no exception. It reminds me that the Lynn Center brings together scholars from across the university working in interdisciplinary areas of research in comparative, historical, normative, and critical social inquiry. Between ancient and modern worlds, drawing from the humanistic social sciences and ranging from disciplines from history to classics, architecture, political science, philosophy, and computer science. I'm so glad to see many of the members of the 5, actually now 6 research groups of the Lynn Center. And if you would like more information on them, I do encourage you to look at the Lynn Center website. 10 years ago, the donor who endowed us to establish this center, Dr. Yan P. Lin, provided his gift so that we can pursue free inquiry in these areas that help to enrich our understanding of both of the past, the present, and the future. And I can't help but say that, you know, thinking about taxation matters and how it matters and why people defend themselves, you know, we can relate in Canada right now, given tariffs and other threats. And I was especially inspired by your original point that started everything, saying, well, yes, there were 10 times more soldiers than population, but defense was not doomed. And I think that's also important to think about in our contemporary context. So this is a wonderful lecture, and I hope that you'll all come to the next Lynn Center, actually 10th anniversary events that are scheduled for October 30th. So please mark that in your calendar. You can also look at the Lynn Center website. We will have two scholars, Stephen Pincus from also the University of Chicago, as well as Jill Frank from Cornell University, talking about empires and other aspects in ancient and modern societies. But thank you all so much for coming, and please join us for a reception just in the room next door.